The wedding registrar looked at me over the top of her glasses and smiled warmly. You may now sign as husband and wife. I should have felt lucky. Instead, my hands trembled so badly that the pen nearly slipped from my fingers. Across the table sat Eleanor Whitmore, calm and graceful in a pale blue coat instead of a wedding dress, her tired eyes fixed on the papers between us. She didn't look nervous. She looked relieved. Not because she was marrying me, but because the arrangement was finally complete. 3 months earlier, I had been a man with a tiny rented room above a bakery and a future that looked painfully ordinary. I repaired watches in a small shop near Brighton Pier. My life was quiet, predictable, and lonely in a way I'd stopped noticing. Then Eleanor walked into my shop carrying a broken silver pocket watch. And somehow, that moment changed both our lives. She had arrived just before closing time. Elegant but exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept properly in months. The pocket watch belonged to her father, she explained, and it had stopped ticking the morning he passed away. I know it sounds sentimental, she'd said softly, but I can't bear the silence. I remember opening the watch carefully and realizing the mechanism itself was fine. The problem was smaller than she thought, a bent spring trapped beneath years of dust. It only needs patience, I told her. She smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen on her face. That would be nice, she whispered. For something in my life to only need patience. She returned the next afternoon to collect it. Then she came back again a week later with another clock from her home. After that, she started bringing tea from the cafe next door whenever business was slow. At first I assumed she was lonely. Later, I learned loneliness wasn't even the half of it. Eleanor lived in a large coastal house left to her by her late father, Arthur Whitmore, a respected schoolteacher known throughout the community for funding scholarships and helping struggling families. But after his death, legal complications surfaced. The inheritance had conditions attached to it, conditions tied to the family estate. She had to be married within 6 months to retain ownership. If not, the property and most of the assets would transfer to a distant relative who had never cared about Arthur, the town, or the charitable foundation Arthur spent decades building. I know it sounds absurd, Eleanor admitted one evening while we sat outside my shop with paper cups of tea. My father wrote the clause years ago when he worried I'd isolate myself forever after my mother died. He thought marriage meant stability. And now? Now it means a deadline. She laughed lightly, but her eyes filled with sadness. I asked if she had someone she loved. No, she answered honestly. Not anymore. There was a long silence after that. Then she asked the question that changed everything. Thomas, would you ever consider marrying someone for practical reasons? I thought she was joking. She wasn't. The proposal she offered wasn't romantic. It was painfully practical. A legal marriage. 1 year minimum. No expectations beyond companionship and helping preserve her father's foundation. In return, she would ensure I was financially secure enough to finally own my own repair shop. You'd be helping more than me, she explained carefully. The foundation pays school meals for dozens of children. If the estate disappears, all of it disappears. I should have refused immediately. Instead, I asked for time. For 3 nights, I barely slept. Not because I feared marrying Eleanor. The truth was far more dangerous. I already cared about her. Maybe too much. But I also understood something else. People like Eleanor belonged to a different world. Her family hosted charity galas while I spent evenings repairing second-hand alarm clocks. She carried grief with elegance. I carried mine in silence. A marriage like this could only end one way, painfully. Yet when I pictured her losing everything her father built, I couldn't walk away. So I said yes. And now there we were in the registrar's office signing papers that legally tied our lives together while 2 witnesses smiled politely nearby. No music. No flowers. No grand declarations. Just signatures. When we stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, Eleanor looked at me carefully. You've done something incredibly kind for me, Thomas. I forced a smile. That's what husbands are for, isn't it? For the first time since I'd known her, she laughed properly. And that sound stayed with me all evening. We moved into the Whitmore house the following week. The place overlooked the sea and felt far too large for two people who barely understood what they'd become to one another. Eleanor gave me a bright room on the second floor and insisted I should feel at home. But I didn't. Not at first. I felt like a guest wandering through someone else's life. Still, slowly, routines formed. I repaired watches in the conservatory because the light was better there. Eleanor handled foundation paperwork in the adjoining room. We shared breakfasts. Sometimes dinners. Sometimes long quiet evenings by the fireplace. The strange thing about kindness is how quietly it changes people. Eleanor always noticed small things. She realized I skipped lunch when business was slow and began leaving sandwiches near my tools without mentioning them. When winter arrived, she knitted me a scarf despite insisting she was terrible at knitting. She was terrible at knitting. I wore it anyway. And she smiled every time she saw it. In return, I fixed every clock in the house until the place sounded alive again. Arthur Whitmore had collected clocks from all over Britain, and for years most had stopped working after his illness worsened. One evening Eleanor stood in the hallway listening to them tick. "It sounds like home again," she whispered. That was the first night she cried in front of me. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly, like someone finally too tired to stay strong. I sat beside her on the staircase for nearly an hour while she spoke about her father. How he believed kindness mattered more than success. How he remembered every student's name even decades later. How lonely the house became after he died. "I thought marrying you would solve a legal problem," she admitted softly. I didn't expect it to make the house feel less empty. I didn't know what to say to that. Because the truth was, she'd done the same for me. Weeks turned into months. People in town started treating us like a real married couple. The grocer asked about Eleanor whenever I shopped alone. Elderly neighbors invited us to community events. Children from the foundation waved excitedly whenever Eleanor visited the schools her father once supported. And somewhere along the way, pretending stopped feeling like pretending. Not because romance suddenly appeared like a film scene. But because real affection grew slowly in ordinary moments. Like when Eleanor waited awake for me after I worked late. Or when she started bringing damaged clocks home just to watch me repair them. Or when I caught myself memorizing the sound of her footsteps in the hallway. I loved her long before I admitted it to myself. Which made everything harder. Because our arrangement still had an ending. 1 year. That had been the agreement. And Eleanor never spoke about changing it. The closer we got to spring, the more distant she became. At first I blamed stress. The foundation was expanding its meal program and she worked tirelessly. But then came the missed dinners. The distracted conversations. The way she avoided looking directly at me whenever our hands accidentally touched. Something was wrong. One evening I finally asked. "Have I done something to upset you?" Eleanor looked startled. "No. Of course not. You've barely spoken to me all week." She stared toward the sea beyond the windows. "Thomas, what happens when our year ends?" There it was. The question I dreaded. I tried to answer lightly. "I assumed we'd discuss it." "And if you want your freedom back?" The word freedom hurt more than it should have. This marriage never trapped me. But it wasn't real either, she said quietly. I looked at her then, really looked at her. The exhaustion. The fear. The sadness she tried so hard to hide. And suddenly I understood. She loved me too. But she believed I could never truly love her back. Before I could answer, the front doorbell rang. The interruption felt cruel. A man stood outside holding a leather folder and an expensive smile. Daniel Mercer. The distant relative. I had met him only once before, briefly after the wedding. Even then he seemed more interested in the estate than the family. I was hoping to speak with Eleanor privately, he said. She allowed him into the study while I remained in the hallway, pretending not to hear. But voices carry in old houses. You can't seriously intend to stay married to a watch repairman forever, Daniel scoffed. Thomas is my husband, Eleanor replied firmly. For now. Everyone knows the arrangement was temporary. Silence followed. Then Daniel lowered his voice. There are investors interested in the property. Sell now, Eleanor. You're wasting your future hiding in this museum. My father built this foundation to help people. And sentimentality will bankrupt you. I heard Eleanor stand abruptly. You should leave. Daniel sighed impatiently. You're emotional because you're lonely. But loneliness isn't love. His words hit harder than he intended. Because part of me feared he was right. After he left, Eleanor remained in the study alone for nearly an hour. When she finally emerged, her eyes were red. I'm sorry you heard that, she whispered. He's wrong. Is he? Yes. Her voice trembled slightly. Thomas, why did you really marry me? The truth stood between us, terrifying in its simplicity. Because I loved you. But fear is a strange thing. It convinces people silence is safer than honesty. So instead I said, you needed help. The disappointment in her face was immediate. Not anger. Something sadder. Oh, she murmured. And she walked upstairs before I could fix the damage. That night I sat awake in the conservatory listening to clocks tick while realizing I might lose the best thing that had ever happened to me because I lacked the courage to speak honestly. Arthur Whitmore once wrote letters to Eleanor every birthday. She had shown them to me months earlier. One line returned to me now. The people who matter most deserve clarity, not guesses. At nearly midnight, I finally stood and walked upstairs. Eleanor sat in the library wrapped in a blanket, pretending to read. She looked up as I entered. I think, I said carefully, I answered your question badly earlier. She closed the book slowly. When you asked why I married you, the truth is, I agreed because helping you mattered to me almost immediately. She remained silent. And somewhere between shared breakfasts and broken clocks and terrible knitted scarves, I laughed softly. I forgot this marriage was supposed to be temporary. Tears gathered in her eyes. I kept waiting for you to regret it. I never regretted a single moment. The room felt impossibly still. Then Eleanor whispered the question that mattered most. If there had never been paperwork, would you still have chosen me? This time I answered without fear. Every single time. She covered her mouth as tears finally slipped down her cheeks. Not dramatic tears. Relieved ones. The kind people cry when they've carried loneliness too long. I crossed the room slowly, giving her every chance to step away. She didn't. When I held her hands, she laughed shakily through tears. We're quite terrible at communicating for a married couple. Technically, I said, smiling, we've only just become a real one. For the first time since the registrar's office, our marriage felt honest. Not built on obligation. Built on choice. The months that followed became the happiest of my life. Not perfect. Real. Eleanor continued running the foundation, but she stopped carrying every burden alone. I expanded my repair business into a proper shop funded not by obligation, but by a partnership we built together. Local teenagers apprenticed with me after school. Eleanor created scholarship programs in her father's name. The Whitmore house changed too. It no longer felt like a monument to grief. It became full of life again. Children visited during community events. Music returned to the hallways. Laughter echoed through rooms that had once sat silent. One afternoon nearly a year after our wedding, Eleanor found me repairing a small brass clock in the conservatory. You know, she said thoughtfully, there's something wonderfully poetic about you fixing broken things for a living. I smiled without looking up. Most things aren't truly broken. Just neglected. She leaned against the doorway. That sounds exactly like something my father would have said. I glanced at her then. Maybe he was right. Later that evening we walked along the shoreline as the sun lowered across the water. You ever think about how strange this all was? I asked. The legal marriage? The entire thing. Eleanor laughed softly. I think my father would be very amused. Why? Because he spent years trying to convince me that love rarely arrives the way people expect. The wind lifted strands of her hair as she looked toward the horizon. I thought I needed rescuing financially, she continued. But what I really needed was someone willing to share ordinary days with me. I understood exactly what she meant. People speak about love as if it's built from grand gestures. But often it grows from smaller things. Shared tea. Quiet understanding. Someone remembering how you take your toast. Someone waiting for you to come home. Someone making an old house feel warm again. We stopped near the edge of the pier where lights glimmered across the water. Eleanor slipped her hand into mine. You know what's strange? She asked. What? You were supposed to become my legal husband. I smiled. And what did I become instead? She looked at me with the kind of certainty that changes a person forever. My home. And standing there beside the sea, with the clocks of our old life finally ticking forward instead of backward, I realized something simple and beautiful. Sometimes the most important relationships begin for practical reasons, ordinary reasons, even accidental reasons. But kindness has a way of turning ordinary beginnings into extraordinary futures. And love, real love, is rarely the thing people plan for. It's the thing that quietly grows while people are busy helping one another heal.